5 keys to understanding your expense ratios. The expense ratio on a property is a key determinant that multifamily investors should be considering when looking at a possible acquisition. And today we're going to talk about why that's so important to make sure that you're incorporating in your underwriting. So first, let's talk about what an expense ratio is. An expense ratio is basically the amount of expenses of a property relative to what their NOI is. So if you look at the top line revenue, if that's $100,000 and you have $40,000 in expenses, that means it has a 40% expense ratio. And that's kind of like an industry norm, but the expense ratio can be influenced by two major factors. That's really location and the class of the building. So location and the class can sway that ratio either way, but generally the higher class of a building, the lower the expense ratio will be. And the location then has a lot of bearing on all different classes of property locations. So those 5 variables that you really want to look at and consider are number one, property taxes. So property taxes, of course, vary largely all over the U.S., with New Jersey being one of the highest property tax states and Hawaii actually being one of the lowest. So understanding what the property tax ratio does, because it's such a large expense, is really key. Now, a lot of states throughout the U.S. actually reassess property taxes when a sale happens. So you need to make sure you're on point understanding what the post-sale tax reassessment will be. However, in Pennsylvania, they do not reassess property taxes at sale, which can actually result in a lot of disparity between some older buildings that have a much lower property tax basis and new construction assets, because they have a much more recent property tax assessment. So generally, Class A buildings are going to have much higher property taxes than an older Class C building, whereas that might not have the same disparity in a lot of other states throughout the U.S. So understanding what that local municipality does to that tax basis is really key. The second thing is the insurance. Now, again, location, huge determination, because the insurance cost in states like Florida and California just runaway crazy. But in certain regions where there's not a lot of natural disasters, we're in the Northeast here, and thankfully we don't get impacted quite to the same degree, so the insurance rates are generally stable. So with the class of the building, usually the much newer Class A property is going to have much lower insurance than the older Class C buildings, because you have much better safety mechanisms and modern safety features in new buildings, and generally a better tenant base than older C-class buildings. So that's going to influence the insurance, skewing it according to the class and location as well. The third thing you really want to be examining is your labor and maintenance costs. So maintenance costs can really eat a multifamily owner alive, but if you can control that, it really can make the difference between making money and not making money. So areas that have labor union requirements or a really high minimum wage, both of those factors can really influence your labor costs, which is a large component of the maintenance cost. So understanding what that local region, state, municipalities rules are on labor and how it's going to affect your maintenance costs, really key. Fourth thing is utilities. Now, most landlords are going to want all of the utilities to be on the tenant, but that's definitely not the reality for most buildings out there. So the utility costs can really be impacted tremendously by the location, as well as, again, the class of building, because newer Class A buildings, generally very well insulated, have much more efficient water flow features, and make a better use of the utilities that they're consuming than older C-class buildings. And also, oftentimes, older C buildings have much more of the utilities coupled together that the landlord's paying than newer Class A properties. So that's really a key determinant, as well as the location throughout the U.S. You know, if you're going to have a really high air conditioning costs in a lot of the Sun Belt area, and of course, much higher heating costs if you're in Chicago. So, big difference there depending on what the landlord is paying or not in that building. And just keep in mind that there's definitely ways you can do to reduce those costs. So, I always encourage people to look at putting solar panels on the roofs if they're paying for a significant common area electric expense and things like that to reduce those. And then the fifth thing is regulation. Now, this is becoming more and more of a thing because requirements around lead-based inspections and testing and other environmental regulations, as well as just general building inspections for rental properties, can really, there's a lot of municipalities that are really starting to come down hard on property owners in reference to that. So making sure the building is compliant and has met those requirements and is going to be able to continue with any rental inspections without a significant amount of work is really key as well in that ongoing maintenance and expense requirement. So those are really the major variables that go into that expense ratio, and understanding how big that is relative to the property and what's normal for your area is important. So for instance, if you have a 55 expense ratio, you're much more exposed to having your NOI reduced if those expenses go up than the owner of the building that has a 30% expense ratio, because if those go up, it's eating up less of the NOI than the building owner that only has 45% left for his NOI. So just keep those things in mind as you're evaluating your multifamily investments. I hope this video brought you some value. If so, please like, comment, and share. And if you're looking for multifamily properties in Pennsylvania or Maryland, please reach out to us. We're always happy to help.